Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the Embodied Cognitive Science Seminar series. Today we will have two talks, and as always, we are recording, but we will pause the recording for the discussions. For the first talk, we are very happy to welcome Ivana Konvalinka. Ivana is an associate professor at the Section for Cognitive Systems, Technical University of Denmark, DTU Compute. She's interested in neuro and behavioral mechanisms that underlie and shape social cognition and interaction, particularly in the context of social coordination of actions. Today, she will be presenting several experimental studies that investigate how interpersonal factors shape the changing dynamics of social coordination between two people and discuss the mechanisms that facilitate interpersonal coordination of actions. Ivana, thank you for joining us today. Sorry again for these technical issues in the beginning, and please, the stage is yours.
Thanks so much, and no worries at all. And first, I'd just like to say thanks to Tom for inviting me to take part in these exciting seminar series, and thanks, Natalia, for organizing them and for the nice introduction. I'm also looking forward to doing this in person quite soon, actually in 2 weeks. But for now, I'm in the basement. I've got a sick kid, so bear with me. I'm hiding out. And today, as Natalia said, I'm going to talk about the interpersonal factors that shape real-time social interaction dynamics. So since you already gave a nice introduction into some of my work, I'll just begin by what you all already know, that social cognition has gone through this, the field has gone through a huge movement in the last decade and a half, with the attempt to go beyond studying isolated individuals. And by isolated, I mean from other people and from interactions. So, and with this movement also emerged the field of joint action, with the studies looking at how the mechanisms that are engaged when people engage in social interaction. So in other words, the proposal has been the social cognition is fundamentally different when we engage in interaction rather than remain mere observers. However, even within the joint action field, there's still been a very big focus on individual mechanisms. So as you see in this picture, EEG is being measured from one person while engaging in interaction with two others. And that's sort of been kind of the push towards this two-person neuroscience, or I want to say interpersonal neuroscience, mostly with an explosion of hyperscanning studies in the last decade, looking at interbrain mechanisms, which I'm actually not going to talk about today, but I'll save some of it for in person. I'm going to focus more on behavioral mechanisms. And the challenge with this is, so if you look at this motion capture of video of two people, so this is two people giving each other a hug. And you can see from kind of the data perspective, this looks quite awkward. You probably don't even know what's going on. They're kind of crashing into each other. So when we get down to actually measuring this, becomes quite complicated. And this has been the main challenge, or I don't want to say the main challenge, one of the challenges in the field. And so most of my work is within nonverbal coordination. This is sort of the framework for understanding social mechanisms. So this is the ability to nonverbally coordinate actions together with other people, which is central to our everyday interactions. And this can be intentional, such as between synchronized swimmers who are experts at synchronizing and coordinating movements with others, or it can be unintentional. For example, emergent synchronization following a musical performance, or between fans at a sporting event. When they begin to clap, they fall into sync with one another without kind of the explicit intention to do so. And coordination is not always symmetric, so it's often asymmetric, meaning that it requires different tasks and demands between individuals, which are implicitly coordinated and balanced. And so from the very large body of joint action studies, we know quite a bit about the individual level mechanisms that underlie coordination. For example, we know that coordination is facilitated by prediction of others' actions, by predictability of our own actions. So in other words, we make ourselves predictable for others, which can be both unintentional or intentional, by signaling, so exaggerating our own actions to signal the goal to our partner. However, once again, these are all averaged individual level mechanisms. And so they don't tell us about the interpersonal differences and factors that influence coordination. And from the perspective, from the ecological dynamics perspective, which I think you'll hear more about from Lyndon quite soon, there have been also many studies that looking at kind of the interpersonal coordination mechanisms. And so you probably know all of these studies, but just to give some examples, from Richardson and colleagues, they showed that when two people are seated next to each other in rocking chairs, they fall into sync with one another, even without the explicit instruction to do so. So in other words, they begin to rock in sync. And this is even if the natural frequencies of the rocking chairs are different. So for example, if they put weights onto one of them, they overcome these differences and still fall into sync. And this happens across different bodily signals. So also when people engage in conversation with one another, they synchronize their postural sway, even when they're not looking at each other, but as long as they're talking to one another. And once again, so these are sort of, this is looking once again at sort of symmetric level mechanisms, which are also averaged across people. So it doesn't tell us something about how interpersonal differences modulate coordination. And there's one study that from actually 1994, which I really love, which looked at how interpersonal differences in social competence modulate interpersonal coordination dynamics. So in other words, they recruited 3 groups of pairs, heterogeneous pairs and homogeneous pairs, meaning that the heterogeneous pairs, they had one person who had high social competence and one who had low, and the homogeneous ones, they had 2 groups of participants, one in which both had low and one in which both had high. And what they found was that so they had to rock these pendulums next to each other, and they found that the heterogeneous pairs coordinated better or were more stable than homogeneous pairs. Also, the ones who had high level competence. So in other words, it suggests both that some sort of reciprocity rather than symmetry facilitated coordination, but also that a person's personality characteristics become embodied in their motor movements, and that these traits constrain the synchrony of their social interactions. And so what are the sort of underlying mechanisms that facilitate this coordination or interpersonal coupling? And so in very simple terms, I've always thought about this as action perception loops. So in other words, when we interact with one another, we produce motor commands before we predict the consequences, the sensory consequences of our actions. And we do this simultaneously, and we couple to each other via the environment. And so one person's action output becomes another person's perceptual input, and vice versa. And the sort of the underlying premise of my research is that human coordination or human interaction involves coordinated activity of biological systems, both within, so self loops, and between self-other loops, individuals, which become coupled to each other as a result of the interaction. And I think one thing that's always missing when we talk about things this way is that this self-other coupling or self-other integration is also modulated by interpersonal differences across task goals, across constraints, competence, and social factors. And these become embodied via both bottom-up, so task-related effects, and more top-down beliefs that we might have about each other. And so this is what I'm going to talk about today. I don't know if I'm going to go over time. I hope not. I'm already going a little bit slow, but I'm going to talk about how interpersonal coordination mechanisms are modulated by both task-related and high-level social interpersonal factors. And so looking at how asymmetry in task demands modulates interpersonal coordination, how task-related expertise modulates interpersonal strategies and self-other integration, and what is the role of the relative feedback that people have of each other's actions in facilitating interpersonal coordination. And finally, I'll talk about sort of a more pilot study, even though it was done many years ago, but which we're starting up with a new project now, looking at how interpersonal diversity and how we connect to and with others modulates the real-time coordination mechanism. And so to dive in study 1, so as I said, coordination is not always symmetric. So in other words, we often have to produce complementary actions, and we have complementary task demands. So this person, when two people are carrying a couch together, one person might walk backwards, one person might walk forward. And this means that they will have different task difficulties and have to adapt to each other differently. And people also take on complementary roles of a leader or a follower, for example, when dancing tango. And so we were interested in what happens to coordinated behavior when task difficulty of one individual is manipulated. And so this was done together with Joshua Skews. We were PhD students at the time, and we were both working on two different things, and we kind of combined our research to investigate this. So what we recruited pairs of participants, and we gave them both an auditory and a visual stimulus. And so in this task, the participants get an auditory stimulus through their headphones. They're in two separate rooms. And this is a metronome at 96 beats per minute, which then ceases. And then they're instructed to click. And I'll show you what I mean by that. And we manipulate their auditory feedback. So they can either be in a condition where they just hear themselves, or where they hear each other. So I'm hearing you, you're hearing me, or mediated coupling condition where they both hear a computer metronome, which is completely regular. And so what they have to do is they have to tap in the spaces between these rectangles and on their own screen, and they have to synchronize the timing of their tap. So the only feedback they have from the other is the time when they click, so which they receive through their headphones. And so what we manipulate is this asymmetry in task difficulty. So in other words, on each trial, one person is assigned the role of a reference, and they have the widest possible spaces to tap in, and the other person is assigned the role of the target. So this changes on a trial by trial basis, and we have 5 different target widths. So on the easiest one, they'll have the exact same task, and then the widths will get smaller and smaller, so meaning that the task becomes more difficult. And so what we look at is how does this symmetry versus asymmetry influence the coordination dynamics. And so in the case of the symmetric task, what we find is that their interclick intervals, they oscillate on a click by click basis. So like if I went faster on the last click, you speed up on the next one, and I simultaneously slow down. And so we quantified this using these cross-correlation lag coefficients, using windowed cross-correlation, so treating it as if they're not completely stationary, these time series. And so what we find is that we get this high lag 1 and lag -1 continuous correlation coefficients, meaning that both people are adapting to each other's previous click equally. So in other words, in the symmetric task, we get a mutual adaptation. But interestingly, in the asymmetric task, we see that one person adapts more than the other. So in other words, they fall into the role of a leader follower. Can anyone guess which one is the leader and which one's the follower? The one with the simple or the difficult task?
Simple is the leader.
The simple is the leader. Yeah, exactly. So the one with the easier task becomes the leader, and the one with the difficult one, the follower. And further, we wondered, how do the leader-follower dynamics affect the performance or the synchronization? And so if we look at the synchronization indices across the different indices of difficulty, what we find is that actually synchronization is better. So this is in blue, with an adaptable person than a completely regular metronome. So even though the person is quite variable, the people do this better together than when they have a very regular beat. And this is achieved by this leader-follower strategy. And so, and in other words, so the coordination seems to be facilitated by mutual adaptation when the task constraints are symmetric, so when they have equal difficulty, and implicit negotiation of these leader-follower roles when task constraints are asymmetric. And so importantly, what I didn't mention is that they're not aware of this manipulation at all. So they don't know what their partner sees or what their partner's task is, or even that they may not have the same task. So this is purely negotiated through the coordination dynamics that they receive. And so presumably the leader kind of decouples and focuses more on the self, while the one with the easier task adapts more. And so next, I want to talk about how task-related expertise, so in terms of how expert people are in achieving these different tasks, can influence coordination dynamics. And so this study was done together with Ole Adrian Hegley, who was a PhD student at the time, and we designed this actually polyrhythm type of tapping task, which I'm not going to go into the details of, but basically quite similar to the previous one. We also manipulated whether people heard each other or they heard a metronome or they heard themselves. And I'm only going to talk about the interactive condition today. But basically, this study was done with professional musicians and different kinds of musicians, so ones that play different instruments. And so what we looked at was, are we once again going to see this kind of mutual adaptation from professional musicians? Do they also, are they more likely to negotiate leader-follower roles? Are they going to mutually adapt to one another? And what we found actually in the data when we did like a similarity profile analysis is that there were 3 significant clusters of the data. So in other words, we had 2 clusters where the musicians where they adapted mutually to each other. This is cluster 2 and 3. And we had this cluster 1 where they actually didn't adapt at all to one another. So in other words, it was as if they were not even interacting. We had these very low correlation coefficients. And so importantly, when we looked at how well they performed, all the groups of musicians performed really well on the coordination test. So there was no difference in synchronization between the 3 groups. But this leading strategy in cluster 1 was found solely in drummers. So in other words, it was the drummers became kind of the metronomes in this interaction, and they didn't adapt at all to one another, but they still managed to synchronize perfectly if you look at the synchronization, which makes a lot of sense. And the mutual adaptation was found in the other expert musicians. So in other words, it's the expertise gave some more flexibility in negotiating these interpersonal coordination strategies. And further, what Ole looked at was, how can we measure, can we quantify self-other or model self-other integration across these different interpersonal strategies? So what do these interpersonal strategies tell us about how we integrate ourselves with the other? And so we applied this Kuramoto model of coupled oscillators to all the data, both in expert musicians and non-experts, so across several tapping experiments, where we took, and you can see all the different synchronization strategies that we applied the model to. And so basically each person was modeled by 2 oscillators representing perception and action, which are intrinsically coupled. So this is kind of the self coupling, and also extrinsically coupled. So the 2-person units are coupled so that the action oscillator of one unit is unidirectionally linked to the perception in the other unit, representing this extrinsic flow of information, and vice versa. And so the only difference, so this is based on the Kuramoto model of coupled oscillators, but the connection strength between each pair of oscillators is defined by this coupling matrix. So in other words, this can tell us how strong is the coupling between the different units when we apply this model. And this model was able to capture the behavior of the different interpersonal strategies quite well. But interestingly, what we found is that when we applied this to the kind of the leading or our drummers data, so what we found, as we expected, is that the leading strategy led to high within personal coupling, meaning that they're more self-focused, and low between personal coupling. And more interestingly, when we applied it to the mutual adaptation data or strategies, we found that the mutual adaptation led to high between person, but low within personal coupling. So in other words, when people adapt to one another, they seem to kind of decouple their own perception action loops. And I have a lot more data in this domain, but I'm going to save that for the in-person conference in 2 weeks. So the point here mostly being that expertise gave people more flexibility in how they balanced out the self-other integration versus segregation. Okay, so across all these tasks and sort of our aims of what we want to, of how we want to study social interaction, we always consider that when information flow is bidirectional, this sort of facilitates social coordination. And so I want to address kind of what is the role of this relative feedback. So how important is bidirectional feedback for interpersonal coordination? And so all the previous work suggests that reciprocity is best. When people are reciprocal, they coordinate with each other best because they mutually predict and adapt to one another. But there's also work that suggests that the bidirectional information flow is not as important if the partner is completely predictable, given that the two people have symmetric tasks. We saw that with asymmetric tasks, this isn't quite the case. And in addition, there are studies from this mirror game paradigm that show that even though people coordinate best when they mutually predict and adapt to one another without a designated leader or follower, if they look at kind of the individual signatures of the behavior, they find that people actually become more predictable when engaged in this reciprocal mutual interaction with one another. In other words, even though they might produce individual signatures of movement improvisation when they act alone as leaders, when they act together, they always converge on this universal stroke of motion. And so what we wanted to address further is interpersonal coordination facilitated by the mutual reciprocity between partners, meaning that bidirectional feedback is necessary, or is it facilitated through emergence of more predictable patterns during bidirectional interaction, meaning that it would only be necessary for one member to have been in bidirectional interaction? And so to investigate this, we looked at, we designed a two-person joint breathing paradigm where we use biofeedback to feed each other's breathing signals to different people, and also manipulate how much feedback people had of each other. So in experiment 1, we had people engage in 2 different kinds of interactions, one in which they could each see each other's breathing signals on the screen. So this is like basically like a sinusoid. When they inhale, it goes up. When they exhale, it goes down. And they were asked to synchronize with the feedback they received. So they didn't receive feedback of their own, only of the other person's. And in the unidirectional interaction, they received feedback of a confederate's breathing rhythm. So the confederate was just asked to breathe at rest, and the people weren't aware of this manipulation, so they were just told that they would interact with 2 different people. And in a second experiment, what we did was to investigate whether it is the reciprocity or the predictability that facilitates interpersonal coordination. We fed back the data that emerged from the bidirectional interaction in experiment 1 to a new set of participants in experiment 2. So what we call the control offline interaction. And so just to give you like a visualization of the raw data from individual participants. So these are the bidirectional, so you see kind of these very regular breathing patterns, and in the bidirectional interaction, they look pretty aligned. And in the unidirectional, they lag a little bit behind the confederate. And so what we did was we extracted the phase of each individual signals, and then we looked at the distribution of the relative phase. And so when we compare the bidirectional and unidirectional interaction, and we look at the relative phase distribution, so just to give you an idea, if we get a uniform distribution, then there is no synchronization. But if we get a peak somewhere, then it tells us that they are in phase with one another. And if the peak is at relative phase of 0, they're in phase. And the height of the peak tells us how strong the phase locking is between them. So here what we find is that people are more in phase, but less phase locked when feedback is bidirectional versus unidirectional. And interestingly, when we contrast this to our control offline condition, we actually find no difference between the bidirectional and the control offline. So people are just as synchronized with, in the offline interaction with a non-responsive partner who was in an online interaction with another person as in the bidirectional interaction. So this suggests that it's not necessarily the reciprocity which facilitates coordination. And so to dive a little bit deeper, we wanted to measure whether the predictability of the signal in people who engaged in this bidirectional interaction can tell us something about how well people do. And so if you look at the left plot, so this is the in-phase occurrence for the 3 different conditions. You can see that they're more in phase, as you saw in the previous plot as well, but there's also like a large variability in how in phase people are with one another. And similarly, one of the first things we looked at was kind of the real-time predictability of the people's signals. So how fast or slow they're breathing can tell us something about the real-time predictability. In other words, if people are breathing really slow, they might be easier to synchronize to. And so if we look at the mean respiration period, we see a huge distribution in the bidirectional condition, where we see in the unidirectional, because the confederate was such a regular breather, we see a very small distribution. And if we look at how this is associated to how well they synchronize across both in-phase occurrence and phase locking values, we find a positive association. So in other words, the slower people were at breathing in the bidirectional condition, the more in phase and phase lock they were. And similarly, if we look at how the period of their breathing in the bidirectional condition, how well did people then in the offline control condition synchronize? And we find the exact same relationship. So the slower people were in this bidirectional condition, the more in phase people were in the offline coordination at synchronizing with them. In addition, we looked at the stability of these breathing frequencies. So in other words, because we see in the unidirectional condition that the confederate is a very stable breather, so we get like a very a common dominant frequency, but in our bidirectional condition we see a huge variability once again. So on the left here we see one person signal, breathing signal, and it's quite a regular breathing frequency, but on the right you can see that they go pretty fast and then they slow down and then they go faster again and then they slow down again. So if we look at this using wavelet analysis, we can capture the kind of the dominant breathing frequency over time. And on the left, we see that it's pretty flat. So in other words, there's not a lot of variability in it. Whereas on the right, we see that there is variability over time. So we extract the dominant breathing frequency across people, and we look at the coefficient of variation over time. So we extract it in small windows. And what we find first across the different conditions, that indeed the coefficient of variation is higher in the bidirectional than unidirectional condition, as we expect. And interestingly, if we compare this with the synchronization data, we find that the lower their coefficient of variation is, the more phase lock they are. So in other words, this kind of predictability of the breathing rhythm also facilitates the interpersonal coordination. And this might explain also why in the unidirectional condition, the phase locking values are higher. Okay, so just to summarize the study, so the real-time alignment of breathing rhythms was higher but less stable when information flow was bidirectional than online unidirectional. But the difference in synchronization between pairs in the online bidirectional interaction and the offline control condition, there was no difference in it. And so basically we found no effect of bidirectional flow as long as one person had engaged in bidirectional interaction, which goes a little bit against the whole reciprocity hypothesis. And the synchronization of breathing rhythms was associated with slower breathing rhythms and less variable breathing frequencies. So in other words, it looks to be that interpersonal coordination is facilitated by the emergence of these predictable breathing rhythms rather than mutual reciprocal interaction. Okay. I hope I'm not overwhelming you with data. So I've gone through some of how task-related differences in task demands or expertise or relative feedback can influence the interpersonal coordination mechanisms. And next, I'd like to talk a little bit about how high-level social factors can also influence these mechanisms. And so there's much less research within this domain. So for example, the concrete question being, do differences in high-level social factors between people modulate real-time coordination dynamics? And so a lot of researcher within interpersonal coordination and joint action has shown that these joint action outcomes are facilitated by social cognitive skills in individuals. So in other words, children with higher social skills synchronize better with others. Pro-social oriented individuals synchronize more than pro-self-oriented individuals, and so on. And once again, this literature is sort of still very much restricted to individual social competences. So we still don't know quite a lot about how interpersonal differences in these social competences can tell us something about the coordination dynamics. So in other words, looking at how interpersonal differences across social cognitive skills or culture or group homogeneity versus heterogeneity. And so we recently started a new project to investigate this. And more concretely, the way we plan to do this is to look at how coordination mechanisms are affected by interpersonal diversity in real-world social networks. And so in this case, interpersonal diversity is defined as the relative differences in how we connect to and with others. So by extracting different social network properties and looking for asymmetries versus symmetries between them, we can get at these spectrum of differences. And so put more concretely is, are the relative differences in social network properties embodied? In other words, modulating the low-level coordination mechanisms between interacting partners. And so a study we ran some years ago, but that wasn't published. I call it a pilot study because we have a small sample size, and we're planning on big time following up on this in the next 4 years of research. And so what we looked at here is we recruited participants from a real world social network, which was mapped out by my colleague Sune Lehman in high resolution. And so this network consisted of 1,000 students, and they were given out, they were each given out phones, and their whereabouts, or I don't want to say whereabouts, they were tracked for a period of 2 years. So their interactions with each other, when they texted each other, when they called each other, where they went and how, and sorry, this was worked out from the data, whether they were testing each other or calling each other. And so this network is mapped out in a very objective way. And basically, we know something about their physical proximity in 5-minute intervals over this period of 2 years. So this is before GDPR, obviously. And basically what we did was we recruited pairs of participants from this network, and we varied the asymmetry in eigenvector centrality between them. And so eigenvector centrality is a measure that tells us something about how connected we are to well-connected others. And there have been several studies showing that people embody or might embody their own and other people's eigenvector centralities, as well as a recent study showing that people with high eigenvector centrality are more likely to adapt to the group in a conversation task. But no one has looked at kind of the asymmetries or differences between people and how this might modulate. And so here we ran like a very low level coordination task. So we recruited pairs of participants from this network, and they engaged in a force production task. So they were each given this little force sensitive resistor to press on. And what they had to do, they had to interact through a visual stimulus. So they received like a visual stimulus, which is a circle, and this told them you have to reach this target force together. And then we varied whether they received continuous visual feedback or only at the end of the trial. They had to coordinate this target force together, but the feedback they received was of the joint force, so of their own and their partners. So in other words, they would have to infer their own contribution or the other person's contribution. And the reason we varied whether it was continuous or not is because we also wanted to additionally tap into different mechanisms. So in other words, one in which they have kind of a continuous adaptation, but in another where they have to mostly do like prediction of their partner. And so just to give you an idea of how these data look, so the raw force data for one trial, so the black line is the target force, the green line is the joint force. So you can see at the beginning, they both press on the devices and they overshoot, but they quickly find this target force together and oscillate a little bit around it. And if we look at the coordination dynamics across all the trials and all the pairs, in the context of windowed cross correlations for this condition, what we find once again is this mutual adaptation overall across people on average, but it goes in the opposite direction from the previous findings. So it's not, so what they do is that if we see this negative correlation at around 500 to 700 milliseconds, positive and negative, meaning that if one person presses too much, the other person releases the force, and vice versa, continuously in time. And so what we wanted to see is whether the relative centrality between participants was associated with the relative coordination dynamics. And so what we find indeed a positive association between the coordination dynamics and the interpersonal differences in eigenvector centrality. So such that the more central a person was in relation to the partner, the more force they contributed to the task. So in other words, if you have people with quite equal eigenvector centralities, they produce about 50-50 to the task. And if one is more central in relation, they produce more. And I should say they're not aware of these numbers. I mean, they know who they're going to be interacting with, and they know that this person comes from their network. But the underlying idea is that this relative measure is embodied. And in addition, we find that the more central people were to their partner, the more variable or adaptable they also were in the partner. To the partner. So in other words, the interacting partners seem to embody their relative social network properties into motor movements, which modulates the coordination dynamics between them. And they do this irrespective of the social relationship. So we also controlled for the social relationship. It's extremely underpowered, but we had three groups of people. So one group was friends, so people who interacted quite a lot with one another. One group was people who were Facebook friends, but they didn't call or text each other or meet up. And one was people who did not know each other or did not seem to engage in interaction with each other. And we see a consistent relationship across all three groups. So in other words, a stable association in centrality and asymmetry in coordination across close friends, acquaintances, and unaffiliated pairs. And so in the upcoming work, what we want to look at is whether people coordinate differently with diverse others. So ones who are more similar or different, more central, and so on. And we also want to look at this on a group level, to look at how does group diversity along various dimensions influence the real-time coordination dynamics. And so since I'm running low on time, I'd just like to summarize. So we find that interpersonal coordination mechanisms are modulated by various interpersonal factors. So whether task demands are symmetric or asymmetric, when they're symmetric, people tend to mutually adapt to each other, and this is the best strategy. When they're asymmetric, they negotiate leader-follower roles. It is also modulated by task-related expertise of the interacting partners. So the expertise seems to give more flexibility to different interpersonal coordination strategies. And while certain types of musicians mutually adapt, the two drummers stick to their own beat like perfect metronomes, mutually ignoring their partner. We also see how relative feedback of another's actions can modulate the interpersonal coordination mechanism. So in other words, the predictability and degree of coordination are modulated whether feedback of another's actions are bidirectional, unidirectional, online, or offline. And finally, we see how asymmetry and centrality can modulate these coordination mechanisms. And so I want to kind of just wrap up, and I know I'm running out of time, but sort of what is still missing in capturing true social interaction mechanisms, and maybe this is an opening also for discussions in 2 weeks. And I think one thing that's really missing is that we know that each interaction is unique. Between two different people, even with the same person, each interaction is unique. And so how do we begin to measure this without averaging over certain parameters across individuals and dyads? Another aspect that I think is lacking is that throughout the course of a single interaction, dynamics change and evolve. So maybe for what I presented, they seem to be quite stable. And there are many groups working on how these dynamics change over time, but I think there's still quite a lot of work to be done in understanding particularly the timescales at which interactive changes happen across different tasks and modalities and interpersonal factors. And so the ability to quantify A and B can also be a possible avenue for better understanding the brain and interbrain mechanisms. So instead of just looking at interbrain synchrony and whether this is better across, or sorry, higher across people who cooperate more or coordinate better, more tying the interbrain dynamics more locally to the interpersonal behavioral dynamics to elucidate the potential mechanisms. And finally, I'd just like to thank all the people who have been involved in this work and who have inspired this work, and all the funding support that has supported our work. And thank you for your attention.